Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's conversation with Sue Biniaz on the Paris Agreement 5 years later. I'll do my formal introduction in a moment, but before I begin, a few logistical notes. After my introduction, I'll turn things over to Sue to speak for a few minutes about the Paris Agreement and how global climate policymaking has evolved since its negotiation and adoption 5 years ago. I'll then ask her a few questions before opening things up to all of you from the audience. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface in the middle, and you can do this at any time. We'll be keeping track. You'll also see a chat button. Please save the chat area for any technical or other logistical issues. But if for some reason you can't see the Q&A button, feel free to insert questions here as well. Finally, please keep it clean and safe for work in the chat and the Q&A, and you'll help us have a really successful event. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of The World Today, a program of Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Affairs think tank. I hope everyone is safe and healthy during these unprecedented times, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all today. My name is Michael Weisberg. I'm the Director of Postgraduate Programs for Perry Worldhouse and a professor and the chair of the Philosophy Department here at Penn. I'm joined today by Sue Biniaz, one of the lead negotiators of the Paris Agreement for the US, and a deputy legal advisor for the State Department for many years. And we're fortunate to be hosting Sue as a Perry Worldhouse Fellow this year. We'll hear from Sue on her broad reflections about the efficacy of the Paris Agreement, how the climate change debate has changed in the past 5 years, and her thoughts on what November's election might mean for the US and global climate policy more broadly. Sue, thanks so much for joining us today for this event with Perry Worldhouse, and thank you so much for helping Perry Worldhouse kick off Penn's Climate Week. I'll turn the floor over to you to begin with your broad reflections on the negotiations of the Paris Agreement, maybe what you wish had gone differently, how the global debate has evolved since your time at State, and what you think should happen next. Sue, over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm going to give the world's fastest history of how we got to the Paris Agreement, and I'll leave some of your questions for your questions. Okay, so this is my kind of view from the trenches. The negotiations of the climate regime were controversial, contentious from the very beginning. Why? It was not just about a narrow environmental issue, but it was about energy, agriculture, things implicating entire economies. It would be expensive to address. In the early stages, climate change seemed very far away. So for a lot of countries, it was simply not a priority, not something you could see before your very eyes. Countries were in very different positions. So for Saudi Arabia, it was existential if the world was to move away from fossil fuels. For small islands, it was existential if there was to be extensive sea level rise. There was a lot of north-south blame, with developing countries saying, you caused this problem, why are you coming to us to help solve it? And just from a US point of view, it was very challenging because it was not a typical foreign policy issue where the executive branch had a kind of constitutional authority to go off and draw up proposals for the Middle East. Everything that the world wanted out of the United States required some kind of congressional involvement, reducing emissions, financial support, et cetera. So against that backdrop, Paris is kind of a miraculous culmination of many decades of trial and error. So I'm going to name the 4 steps on the way, 3 before Paris, and just give you a tiny quick flavor. So the original Framework Convention from 1992 was very general, had very light obligations, and it basically stood for the proposition that if you make the obligations under the agreement very light, you can get the participation of the entire world. It was not surprising because that's the purpose of a Framework Convention, in essence, to get everybody in before making the commitments too stringent. But there was a decision shortly thereafter that the Framework Convention was not really strong enough and that you needed some kind of legally binding emissions targets, to which developing countries said, well, feel free to go and take on those commitments, but count us out. You need to go first. So you ended up with a very binding agreement at sort of one end of the spectrum of stringency, where most things were dictated by the agreement, the targets were legally binding, there were lots of rules. We call that kind of agreement very, very much top down, right? Because the international agreement doesn't give you much national discretion, tells you what to do. And the bottom line of that agreement was the US ended up not joining. China joined, but it didn't have commitments. So you had the two largest emitters in the world essentially excluded from the agreement. So in that sense, it was, you could argue, not very successful. So when the Obama administration came in, they had to figure out like what to do, what position to take. And they basically did not want to negotiate another Kyoto protocol and bring something home that the United States could not possibly join. And furthermore, that excluded the major developing countries. So the Copenhagen Accord, which was the thing that came after the Kyoto Protocol, very much swung the pendulum in the complete opposite direction. It was a thoroughly non-binding instrument. Everybody decides what their own commitment is. They're not, the commitments are not internationally negotiated. Very few rules, and took about a year to even figure out what countries had committed to because there was so little kind of clarity as to the commitments they had taken on. But the bottom line of the Copenhagen Accord was that you got huge amount of participation. You got the US in with a target, China in with a target, all the major economies in with commitments. But you know, at the rigor end of the spectrum, you could say it was kind of the opposite of Kyoto. So you have these two different models. Very stringent on paper, not enough participation. Opposite, lots of participation, not enough rigor. So the challenge for the Paris Agreement is like, how do you get the best of both worlds? Something that's going to have all the right players in, but not so much toward the Copenhagen end of the spectrum that you have everybody in, but they're not committed to doing enough. And that was kind of the trick of Paris. How do you strike the balance? So what did they do? They had several objectives to the agreement. The most kind of salient one is a global temperature increase cap, basically that the world should try to make sure that the increase from pre-industrial levels doesn't exceed well below 2 degrees centigrade, or better yet, 1.5. And then how do you get there? Well, countries should nationally determine their own commitments. So in that sense, it took a page out of the Copenhagen Accord, but instead of saying, oh, and all the rules are completely up to each country, there are many more disciplines in the Paris Agreement, and there's also sort of a hybrid legal approach. So instead of the Kyoto, everything's binding, or the Copenhagen, nothing is binding, kind of takes hits the sweet spot by basically saying, it's legally binding, you have to put in a nationally determined contribution, you have to update it every 5 years, you have to report on how you're doing, et cetera, but the target itself is not legally binding. And that kind of compromise between the two ends of the spectrum enabled Paris to get everybody in, right? So participation was large, but I would also say that the rigor was much more than countries kind of expected. And you know, that's where we ended up in 2015. Since 2015, it's kind of hard to say whether the Paris Agreement is going to be ultimately successful. Most countries took on commitments in the 2030 timeframe, a couple in the 2025 timeframe. So you really can't tell from where we sit right now whether countries are going to end up implementing their targets. Some have commented that if you look at those targets, well, even if they were fully implemented, they don't add up to getting the world to 2 degrees or 1.5. And I would say, well, that's not a surprise. That was completely contemplated in 2015. And that's why the agreement was built as kind of a long-term agreement with a global review every 5 years, and then the requirement that you go home and you update your NDC. So it doesn't give you the picture of right now, just looking at these initial nationally determined contributions, whether the agreement is in fact going to end up hitting the global temperature goal. And then two things have happened in the last couple of years that, you know, might make one more pessimistic. One is that the Trump administration decided to pull out of the agreement. And that, of course, had a kind of depressive effect on ambition worldwide. And then, of course, this year we had COVID. And I think, Michael, you may ask me some follow-up questions about the impact that COVID has had on the regime. So I'll stop there. I hope I didn't take too much time with my intro.
No, that was great. I just want to kind of, before going too deep into the questions, mine or the audience, you know, you say that the trick of Paris is the blend of top down and bottom up, of stringency and of flexibility. But I mean, did it land too flexibly? Because each country still gets to make its own determination. I mean, even in an optimistic scenario, what kind of peer pressure did you anticipate would actually get countries to increase their ambition each year?
Yeah. Well, we don't know yet whether countries are going to increase their ambition. Some have, and that's where COVID comes in this year, because this was supposed to be the year of enhancing ambition. So we'll know better next year. But I would say that, you know, when designing the Paris Agreement, we essentially had three choices, roughly speaking, in terms of how to design the national emissions targets, right? So one would have been, you take 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees and you figure out, okay, let's say that is the limit. What is the aggregate that the world can emit, okay, in order to stay in that, under that temperature cap? And then you allocate it somehow and you say, India, this is how much you can emit. United States, this is how much you can emit. Okay, well, that's completely unrealistic. That's never going to happen. So it's theoretical, but it's not real. The second, which might have been real, but probably wouldn't have worked, would be to negotiate the targets, right? So you don't just decide on your target. Maybe you come up with a proposal, but then everybody has to agree on everybody's targets. Now, we thought that would be unrealistic and would not work in terms of participation for a couple of reasons. First of all, it'd be very difficult to negotiate 200 different targets. Kyoto Protocol was hard enough, and that was just the developed countries. There were only about 30 of them, and they all ended up with different targets, and that took a year and a half to work out. But 200 different targets would be difficult, even if countries were willing to negotiate them, right? But then, would countries be willing to negotiate them? You were trying for the first time to get developing countries in with commitments, beyond Copenhagen into a real kind of legal instrument. Would they be willing to, have some other country tell them, no, that's not a good enough target? I think our judgment was that the way you're going to get everybody to participate is allowing them to decide what makes sense for their national circumstances. So, we picked option 3, and I think it has, it certainly did the trick in terms of participation. Now, later you may come along and say, well, this system didn't really work, it failed. But I don't think that necessarily means the other ones would have worked any better. I think that it's just a really hard problem, and there is no perfect approach.
So I actually want to ask you some questions about the past and some about the future, but my son, Brandon, who's 8 years old, wanted to ask you a question about this kind of topic. So he was wondering, was there ever a prospect of a regime that actually had sanctions or something that really would force the ambition to increase or force countries to really make serious efforts at their targets, even in the early days?
Well, the Kyoto Protocol actually did have a compliance regime attached to it. And there would have been I don't know if you want to call it a sanction, but there would have been a consequence if you went over your target. And the idea was that nobody would, of course, agree to trade sanctions or financial penalties. It's not like, domestic law. But what countries did agree to was Kyoto was supposed to have several 5-year periods kind of back to back. And if you went over, let's say, during period 1, first 5-year period, you'd have to kind of pay back, in a way, the tons that you went over at a rate of 1.3 to 1, right? But when the United States dropped out of the Kyoto Protocol and ended up not joining, the kind of the air came out of the tires. The US was really pushing for that to be a binding consequence. And once we were out of it, the rest of the world said, no. So there was not much of an appetite for some kind of sanction to apply if you went over your target. So I don't think it was seriously considered in the Paris context that you would have it. And I think the consequence of a consequence, if you will, would have been that countries probably would have aimed lower in terms of their ambition, right? Because it's just logical that if you're worried about some, sword of Damocles coming down, if you go over your target, you probably will be more conservative in terms of the target that you come up with. And in fact, that is the reaction I remember from several countries during the Copenhagen Accord days, countries saying, this may sound kind of counterintuitive, but the fact that Copenhagen is not legally binding allowed us to be more ambitious than we would otherwise have been. So I think it is one thing to be careful of when you're looking at a regime. It's hard to come in after the fact and just say, this whole thing looks great, except it should be legally binding, which is what some people, that's their reaction to the Paris Agreement. It's like, oh, I like this whole thing, except there needs to be, a penalty at the end. To me, that just doesn't work, because it was part and parcel of the whole package that there wasn't that thing. Now, having said that, there isn't nothing under the Paris Agreement. Just because there's not a financial penalty or trade sanction at the end doesn't mean nothing happens. There is a strong transparency framework, as they call it, where you have to report on how you're doing towards meeting your target, and it will be apparent to the parties and the world if, in 2031, you did not meet your 2030 target. And now most of it will be sort of name and shame, rather than some thing happening to you. But name and shame plays a big role in international relations. So it's not, it's definitely more than nothing.
Great, thank you so much. So before talking about the present and the future, you said something very interesting in your opening remarks about the world was different around the time the Framework Convention was negotiated, that these issues seem very far off. I just wonder if you could say a little more about that and sort of how it looked even to you as a negotiator in the early 90s versus today. I mean, I think that at least to everybody on this call, climate seems like an existential threat now, but
yeah, well, back then it wasn't, people were not really pointing to extreme weather events and saying that they were a result of climate change. It was more futuristic. Like, if we don't take steps, and we were, they were probably right. If we don't take steps now in advance, we will end up in a situation. Now, the IPCC was set up, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right before the Framework Convention was negotiated, and they were already, their first assessment report looked at the science, the impacts, and possible responses. And of course, a framework treaty was one of the possible responses, which is why it was negotiated. But there was a lot of uncertainty, probably, if you went back and looked at that first assessment report. It was unclear when climate change would hit, and it was unclear how severe it would be. So if you were being, I suppose conservative, if you were being conservative in the sense of taking steps just in case, you would have done much more back then. But it was hard to go to countries, especially developing countries, with higher priorities like, poverty alleviation, hunger, et cetera, and say, this thing that we think is a problem, but we can't really even tell you how much of a problem it will be, has to be your priority. And I kind of contrast it with the ozone layer negotiations, which I was also involved in. There was much more scientific certainty. And, the scientists could get up in front of the policy negotiators and basically say things like, if you want the Antarctic ozone hole to close by 2040, here's the option you would pick. And if you don't care whether it closes, in 2050, then you would pick this kind of weaker option. So there was like a definite line could be drawn between policy choices and kind of impacts. And in the climate world, nobody could really do that at the time. So I think it was harder to get countries to agree to, specific targets.
All right. So a lot of people would like to know the significance of the Trump administration's announcement of their intention to withdraw from the agreement. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, so you probably remember that on June 1st, 2017, or maybe I particularly remember the date, the Trump administration announced that they were going to pull out of the Paris Agreement as soon as they're able to. And their Paris Agreement is typical agreement. This was not unusual, but basically there was a 3-year waiting period before you could withdraw, and then 1 more year before it would become effective. And the arguments, just to add my little spin, to me it sounded like the characterization of the Paris Agreement was the Kyoto Protocol, Like if I hadn't known that President Trump was talking about the Paris Agreement, I would have thought he was talking about the Kyoto Protocol, because it was all about, the US is forced to take on this stringent target and developing countries don't have to do anything, and and it was like, those are actually the exact problems that the United States had with the Kyoto Protocol, which is why the Paris Agreement was designed completely differently. Nobody told you what you had to do. You came up with your own target. And of course, all parties were involved. Developing countries were not chopped out. And the other thing, just one more thing, which listeners may be interested in, is that there was also the option under the Paris Agreement to stay in and change the US target. In other words, the nationally determined approach means that even in midstream, you handed in a target of X% reduction, you could still come in and say, well, actually on second thought, we want to do something less stringent. Now, there was a big debate in the world and also in the United States, like which is worse? Is it worse to pull out entirely, or is it, worse to stay in and weaken the US target? And, people can debate that. But they picked the most extreme option, which was just, withdrawing entirely. So what that means is that the day after the US presidential election, November 4th, the US will cease to be a party to the Paris Agreement. If Trump gets reelected, I don't imagine that they will all of a sudden change their minds about wanting to be a party. If Biden gets elected, it's already one of the campaign commitments that on day one, they would rejoin the Paris Agreement, in which case the US would only have been out, very, very brief amount of time, just a couple months. And because of COVID, the annual conference of the parties is actually delayed until next year. It used to be the thinking that the US would, not be there as a party at this year's COP, but that won't even be the case. Like the US will not even have missed a COP because of the delay.
So if the US stays out, or even frankly in the 3 years since the announcement, I mean, I guess what's the effect? Will the world move on without the US, or will the Paris Agreement collapse without the US?
Yeah, it's really hard to predict. I'm not sure anybody really knows the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. During the last couple of years, before we were out, but everybody, we had already stopped implementing our nationally determined contribution. We were almost like de facto, not really participating mm-hmm. a little bit from a technical point of view. Some of the rules were still being developed. Nobody followed the US lead, right? There was some talk in some presidential elections around the world, Australia, Brazil come to mind. They ran on a platform of, if I get elected, I will pull us out of the Paris Agreement. It didn't happen when they got elected. There was probably some kind of negative impact of US prospective withdrawal. You can imagine if you were in a country where the cabinet is trying to figure out whether the country should take on greater climate action, that the people who were against it could certainly look to the United States and say, well, why are we taking additional action when the United States is walking backwards on action? They're a larger emitter than we are. It was somewhat helpful during the last couple of years, the extent to which US cities and states and other non-state actors kind of rose to the occasion. Pretty much like the day after the announcement in 2017, you had several US states form the US Climate Alliance. It now has about 25 states in it committed to the Paris target, doing what they can to implement it. And you had the We Are Still In movement, which is not governmental. It includes some cities and states, but it's largely like non-governmental actors also committed to taking lots of climate action. And so, it was somewhat helpful kind of diplomatically, I would say, where for other countries to be able to look at the US and not just see a monolith. You know, what they didn't just see federal government gone, but US is actually doing a lot. So if you wanted to argue that your country should continue taking action, you would obviously point to that rather than the withdrawal. Okay, so that's all about like the past. Where have we been to date? I think if the US is, you know, a lot of those countries could probably look at the US situation and say, it's possibly an aberration. They're going to come back. So 4 years we can weather the storm. But if it's not an aberration and it's kind of more real, then I don't know what happens to the Paris Agreement. You could say, well, it'll continue. It might not be as robust as if the US were, you know, actually back in, pushing for greater climate ambition and all of that. And one would hope that that will be the case. There's one design reason, I think, you know, to be somewhat optimistic. I think it would be worse if countries had negotiated their targets, right? Because if you think about the Kyoto Protocol, it's kind of what happened between the US and Canada, right? The US pushed Canada to take on a more stringent target than it necessarily wanted. And the thought, I guess Canada went along with it because they thought, okay, well, our economies are very connected. And, you know, if the US is going to do X, like we'll also do X. Then the US, you know, basically doesn't join Kyoto and Canada's kind of left holding the bag. And they ultimately withdraw a couple of years later from Kyoto because the whole premise of their target like disappears. The Paris design, you know, could work out, things could work out differently because of the Paris design, where every country is in designing its nationally determined contribution based on its own circumstances, not really taking into account like what everybody else is doing. It could make it more likely that they will keep doing that thing and stick to it because that's the thing that they were prepared to do. And it mattered less whether the US was in, out, doing, you know, X or X minus 5. So, you know, and you could also imagine that if Trump wins re-election, the domestic forces in the United States, including the states, the cities, and all the other non-state actors, you know, could increase their action even more than it is now. So maybe the agreement keeps going, you know, for all of those reasons.
I was actually going to ask you about cities, states, things like C40 or private actors, but you covered all of that. I'll just note Penn committed to 75% of its electricity generation being renewable by essentially subsidizing 3 new solar fields being built, so maybe paying for them. So that's really great. I wanted to ask you before we start transitioning to some of the audience questions. We've talked a lot about the mitigation targets, the NDCs, but the Paris Agreement's also about adaptation and about loss and damage. Maybe you could explain a little bit what those issues are and how, you know, the significance of them to the developing world.
Yeah. If I'd had more than 5 minutes to do the history of the
regime, have it now.
I would have added sort of the increased role of adaptation. So if you look at the original Framework Convention and also even the Kyoto Protocol, it's mostly about mitigation, right? The objective is to avoid dangerous man-made interference with the climate system. It doesn't really talk much. There's a little bit on adaptation. Kyoto Protocol really didn't address adaptation at all. Copenhagen addressed it more, but going into the Paris negotiations, there was a big push from developing countries to kind of give equal time to adaptation. Not necessarily to take on new commitments with respect to adaptation. If you look at the adaptation article, it really doesn't have many commitments because the very same countries that wanted it highlighted, they didn't really want new commitments, but it was almost more optical. Like they didn't want an agreement that had pages and pages on mitigation and then, you know, like 2 sentences on adaptation. So yeah, you'll definitely see that playing a bigger role. And it's become a bigger issue because we haven't done enough on mitigation. So obviously, the less you do on mitigation, the more need there's going to be for adaptation. So there's not only like a theological reason for highlighting it, but a substantive reason for highlighting it. Mm-hmm. And the other thing to mention is that if you look at the objectives of the Paris Agreement, there are 3 of them. I only mentioned the first one, which is about the temperature goal, but the second one is all about promoting adaptation, enhancing resilience, okay? So it's right up there as an equal objective. And then you also asked about loss and damage, which has been, a fairly controversial issue in the negotiations. It was raised several years ago by some developing countries as as something that goes beyond adaptation, like that there's a certain point where you can no longer adapt. If your coral reaches have been completely bleached, there's no going back, that's just loss and damage. And they wanted this issue, addressed under the UN Framework Convention regime. So several years ago at the Warsaw COP, they set up what was called the Warsaw International Mechanism, or the WIM for short, on loss and damage, which was supposed to look at ways to minimize loss and damage, interactions with regimes outside of the Framework Convention, including with respect to migration and other implications of climate change, sea level rise, et cetera. But when it came to the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, there was a big issue whether to include it in the agreement or not. And some countries did not want to highlight it. We were one of those countries, and some obviously had the exact opposite view where they definitely wanted it highlighted. For the US, one reason we were, or the only reason, sort of skittish about including it is that some of the developing countries, a real minority, so this was not the prevailing view, but a minority of countries associated loss and damage with reliability and compensation. And the idea was that those things were kind of synonymous. So in the United States, some people, when they heard loss and damage, equated it for that reason with liability and compensation. So wait, you're including provisions in the Paris Agreement that make the United States liable for compensation for US emissions? Are you crazy? So it was sort of a political issue for the United States. So they, after make a long story slightly shorter, there was a long drawn out negotiation of exactly how to deal with loss and damage, whether to include it in Paris, if so, what to say about it. And we took the position that we were ultimately okay with including an article on loss and damage, but it had to be super clear that this was not about liability and compensation. So people who look at the agreement carefully, including not just the text of the agreement, but the decision where lots of other sentences are in the Paris outcome. If you read them together, you'll see, yes, there's an article on loss and damage, and there's continued work on that issue. But it's also clear, our political imperative is in there also, which is this isn't about loss and damage. That doesn't mean the issue's over. There continue to be kind of discussions under the Paris Agreement about loss and damage. Developing countries in some are still think there should be more funding, not compensation necessarily, but still support, financial support for loss and damage. So countries are still debating, should there be more money? If so, where should it, which financial mechanism should be the one responsible for it? What should it pay for, et cetera?
And there was some positive movement at COP25 on the subject.
Yeah.
A small amount, but something. So one more question from me before opening up to the audience. Please, though, feel free, everybody, to be typing your questions. One of the things that's been really interesting about the last couple of years, I think, has been just the just outpouring of youth activism around climate. And I guess, a question one often hears among youth activists is, should we be putting our attention to the UN process, to the Paris Agreement, considering that Kyoto failed, the Paris Agreement seems on life support thanks to the Trump administration. So, I mean, if you could address the youth climate activists, would you want to make a plea for the international agreements that you've been involved in your whole career? Or do you think that they're right to be skeptical?
Well, I don't, I applaud them for taking this issue seriously, but I would just say, don't put your eggs in one basket, right? And I don't think they have, actually, because they were very involved in the UN Secretary General's climate summit last year. There was special attention paid to youth. I think there was a special kind of youth event in New York, right, which was not Paris specific. I mean, obviously, it in a way relates to the Paris Agreement, but it was broader than that. Next year, this postponed COP that's going to take place in 2021, the UK is sharing the leadership of that COP with Italy, and Italy is actually making youth the kind of focus of their so-called pre-COP. So yeah, the youth also do come, youth movements show up at the COP and make a big deal about how the world is not going fast. The scale and the speed is not enough, which has to be right. So yeah, I wouldn't say give up on the international agreement. I'm not sure what the substitute would be. And I still think having the Paris Agreement and its, the pressure on countries to up their ambition, report on what they're doing, be criticized for not doing enough, et cetera. It still plays a positive role in the world. And I'm not sure you're kind of better off in terms of your climate goals by saying, let's scrap that thing and start over again, or have nothing in its place. So I guess I would just say, put your eggs in many baskets, including, but not limited to, the international regime.
So right on the heels of this, one of our questioners was asking about it seems that there's been efforts over the 25 COPs to have greater inclusion of non-state actors. So, the Indigenous Local People's Platform, some representatives of states, kind of very broad range of NGOs. Do you have any suggestion? Like, I guess I'm curious, as a negotiator, did you feel any of the pressure of any of those groups that was steering in the right direction? And do you have any advice for those groups who might want to really calibrate their campaigns?
Yeah, well, in terms of non-state actors, which includes subnational governments, but also non-governmental actors, they've essentially played two different types of roles, I guess I would say. Some are in the advocacy business. They're not literally taking on commitments themselves. And, they've been sort of a mainstay of the international regime, both at the domestic level, right? So I know that when we were preparing our positions for the negotiation, we always met with our domestic non-state actor groups on both the NGO side and the kind of industry side, and met with them during all the COPs kind of every other day to tell them what was going on. So that's kind of on the advocacy side. But more recently, starting a couple of years before Paris, probably in Lima, Peru, there started being sort of another aspect to the non-state actor involvement, which was to actually take on climate commitments. And that would include, companies, cities, states, to a certain extent, NGOs, if they're in the business of reducing emissions, universities. And that's been an interesting additional feature of the Paris Agreement. So in Lima, they set up what they called the Nazca portal, where you could actually, take on a commitment and stick it on this portal, and then people could look. And it's kind of been updated and its name has changed over the years. But it's, in essence, you could basically look up, Coca-Cola by name and see what kind of commitments have they taken on. Or you could press Iowa and see, what kind of targets has the state of Iowa taken on, or some region of some other country. So it's a kind of a useful tool to figure out what's going on below the national level, the party level. And anyway, the Paris just increased that whole Lima spirit of getting commitments and engagement from non-state actors. And, you know, you won't find it really in the Paris Agreement itself. If you only look at that, there's maybe just one little reference to non-state actors. But if you look at the whole thing, including the decisions, million references to the importance of action from non-state actors. Because basically the problem is too big to just, you know, leave it to national governments. Also, there was a sense of wanting to recognize the actions of those kinds of actors, et cetera. And now there's just a huge amount of kind of engagement back and forth between, let's say, the Secretariat, the presidency. There's a global climate action kind of component to the international regime, which, you know, with two champions at all times who are actually, you know, actively reaching out to non-state actors to enhance their commitment. So that, I think now that's just like part and parcel of the regime. Probably makes it quite different from most international treaties, which are very national government oriented. Now, you know, there are issues now with COVID, right? Because one of the things that's happened is like, how do you know, are we going to have the kinds of meetings in the near future that allow the non-state actors to come kind of en masse to the conferences? And if not, you're going to lose a lot. Right? You don't necessarily lose the negotiation among countries, but what about the thousands of people who show up and exchange ideas and, you know, exhibit what they've been doing? That has become a really important part of the COP. In fact, at the last COP, I wrote a little article after the COP saying things like, you know, the side events seemed like more of the main event than the main event, because, you know, the way the Paris Agreement is designed now, you're mostly not negotiating new commitments, right? Each country is putting in its own nationally determined contribution. So there's really not that much left to negotiate. And so they, like, what is the purpose now of these COPs? Partly the purpose is kind of the showcasing and the participation of non-state actors rather than negotiators. Sorry.
If our listeners are not familiar with the COPs, so I mean, these are meetings literally of tens of thousands of people now, and the actual number of negotiators is in the thousands at most.
Yeah.
So more questions from the audience. So you mentioned that if there is a Biden administration, they've already committed to re-entering the Paris Agreement. What, though, beyond that should be, what do you think that the Biden administration's priorities should be beyond just merely re-entering?
Well, if you know, anyone who's interested in that should look at the Biden climate plan, which is online. Now, a lot of it is about domestic action, of course. But I think last time I counted, there were, I think, 24 commitments that related to international aspects of climate policy. And you're right that just rejoining Paris is like the bare minimum, right? That just shows like we've rejoined the human race, I guess you could say. Once you rejoin Paris, of course, certain things come along with that. So that would be one work stream, right? Once you're a party to Paris, you have to have a nationally determined contribution in place. So that's one thing a new administration would have to figure out, like, what is the new nationally determined contribution of the United States? You know, which is a little tricky because they'll just be coming in and having to figure out, like, what kind of legislation can they get, what kind of regulations can they put in place, and simultaneously trying to figure out, like, what's the international commitment that they should be taking on, right? And then, you know, there may be sort of a funding component. There's no like mandatory amount that you need to contribute. It's another way in which the Trump administration characterization was off. It was all about like, we have all these funding obligations we have to get out of. That's not true. But, you know, having said that, if you're going to rejoin Paris and kind of make this a high priority as a matter of, you know, foreign policy, you probably want to put your money where your mouth is. And, you know, in the budget that they seek, they probably would want to include, you know, either making up for, I think that's one of the commitments, campaign commitments, you know, making up for the money that Trump walked away from, you know, or generally just increasing funding. You know, there are also many of the commitments relate to just raising climate change as an issue kind of all over the place. I think that's partly in reaction to the Trump administration, which, you know, took it off the agenda of the G7, kind of walked away from the commitments under the Arctic Council with respect to black carbon and methane. So I think part of it will just be a lot of intense kind of diplomatic activity, both bilateral, trying to get countries to increase their NDCs under the Paris Agreement, but also multilateral, raising it in all kinds of forums where this administration has kind of walked backwards. You know, there are also some trade-related commitments in that list of campaign commitments. So, for example, you know, including more climate-related provisions in U.S. trade agreements to the extent that there are new ones, maybe with the UK or the EU, you could imagine. They're committing to press other countries to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. So that would be another kind of trade-related aspect of international climate policy. And then some of the campaign commitments are more internal, right? Which is like making climate change, you know, a central kind of tenet of U.S. national security, just from the point of view of like, how do you structure the U.S. government, you know, commissioning a national intelligence assessment, directing the Defense Department to report or analyze, you know, this and that. So I think some of them are more, you know, internal, institutional, bureaucratic, or whatever, in order to like enable the government to perform and you know, make this a top priority in terms of U.S. foreign policy, kind of national security. So
and we had some questions sort of along those lines about, you know, who should be, you know, who should really be advising on setting NDCs and things. Do you, I mean, if you could be the philosopher queen, would you, I mean, would you suggest a climate change department, or, you know, a high level seat at the National Security Council, or how do you think our government could be, you know, best whipped into shape quickly to take this on as a really high level commitment?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a domestic component and an international component. I mean, from a domestic point of view, I think there are all kinds of ideas floating out there that everybody can read about. You know, one is to have a specific climate council at the White House on the same level as, you know, National Security Council, National Economic Council, whether that's the idea or whether it should just be highlighted in some other way. I think, you know, I think you could probably do it many different ways. The key is that you're highlighting the importance of the issue and probably, you know, having some high level positions that, you know, enable the government to coordinate itself and make sure each department is taking climate change seriously in its work. From an international point of view, I think they probably need to, you know, go back to something closer to the Obama era model, right? They got rid of the special envoy on climate change in that office, which basically enabled the US to, I think, perform pretty effectively internationally. And I think a lot of people have left the State Department. So you've had a brain drain. So you'd want to like replenish, more than replenish, plus, you know, come up with the functional equivalent of the envoy. You really need someone who's kind of full-time devoted to this this issue, not just a piece of some important person's time. That really enabled us to, you know, be effective internationally, is that we weren't just trying to grab someone's attention who was working on economic issues 95% of the time. So I guess that's what I would say about that.
Okay, great. One of our colleagues who is a climate scientist asks, do you think scientists have been effective in their own, you know, the climate scientists in their own presentation advocacy, or, you know, is there more that they could be doing? I mean, those that are not just interested in doing the empirical research, but thinking about policy, thinking about good communication, where do you recommend that they put their efforts?
Well, I think I think things have improved. I think there was a time when that scientists were not as well trained in communicating their views to like regular people. But I think even the IPCC has improved its, let's say, communication of its results, right? So over the last couple of years, there have been 3 important reports. There have been like the 1.5 degree report, the ocean and the cryosphere, the land report, et cetera. And a lot of attention has been paid in those contexts to being able to explain, so what are the conclusions of the 1.5 report? Because if you actually read the report, it's kind of hard to get through. I mean, every single sentence is like, how much
to my students, Sue, that it's been assigned, so don't tell my students ahead of time that it's hard to read.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's straightforward for them.
It's straightforward. It's very straightforward, but they might want to accompany reading it with, you know, some of the summaries and fact sheets that have been put out that make it more understandable. You know, and I think the press has done a better job, and I don't know if that's that IPCC has done a better job or the press understand, but I think the 1.5 degree report and oceans and land were like particularly kind of accessible to, you know, I don't know about your average person, but your average person interested in this issue. So you can have a sense of what the impacts would be, or the distinction between a 1.5 degree world and a 2 degree world. And, you know, all of that matters because it prompts people to be concerned, and in turn that could lead to action. So I think it is a very important piece of the puzzle.
One of our the watchers asks, what can someone who, just a person who is not a scientist, not a politician, what kind of a really substantial contribution can they make to climate issues? What are your recommendations?
Well, from just a pure domestic point of view, I guess, you know, voting is one, of course. If you care, you'd vote for candidates that care about this issue. Mm-hmm. Lobby, advocate, et cetera. If you mean more professionally, I think there are a million different ways to be part of the climate world. I know just from my own work, there's got so many different fields. It's one of the reasons I find it such an interesting issue. You've got people involved from the science point of view, technology, engineering, economics, policy, law, in my case, foreign policy, domestic policy, et cetera. So it's just like, no matter what your interest is, you can combine it with climate change and play a role in this issue, like including professionally.
Okay. So now we have a dark question. If the current administration remains in place after November 3rd, then what's next?
Well, domestically, I imagine it's going to be more of the same, walking back, unwinding, you know, laws, regulations, et cetera. I can't imagine that would all of a sudden go in the opposite direction, you know, and there's now a Supreme Court aspect to it also, right? So, you know, a more conservative Supreme Court could uphold a lot of the walking back, might even unwind Massachusetts v. EPA, which was the kind of original decision that directed EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. So yeah, it could be sort of dark domestically. And internationally, I've already kind of addressed that. I guess you have the combination of, if you want to think of it this way, the presence of a negative, right? Because you have an administration that's actively promoting fossil fuels, climate is a hoax, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the kind of, so the presence of a negative and then the absence of a positive. So you don't have a United States that is using its leadership and tools and all of that, its platform to push countries kind of what I would consider to be in the right direction. So it's kind of a double whammy, I guess. And, you know, that's already been going on, but, you know, multiply that times some factor over the next 4 years. And, you know, I don't think there's there's nothing good climate-wise that would come out of it, I guess, would be my.
I mean, maybe just, you know, pursuing that a little bit though, does that mean in your mind that the approach that's been taken thus far, sort of multilateral binding agreements, is the right one, or maybe is somehow more stable to have lots of bilateral agreements, lots of leadership by corporations and NGOs and universities. I mean, could you imagine something good coming out of that?
Yeah. Well, I think the good has already come out, right? So I was just addressing what does the US at the federal or the national level kind of bring to the table or take away from the table, right? That doesn't get better. It probably gets worse. But I mean, the silver, if you want to point to some of the silver linings of the last couple of years, yeah, you have all kinds of workarounds, you could say. So, domestically, you have the alliance of the states, and we are still in coalition. Things that probably would not have arisen. I mean, there was some non-state action in the United States, but mostly you were depending on the national government, federal government. So, those kinds of things would obviously continue. And then I think there will be, I think Paris probably continues, but you probably then have more coalitions of other countries or companies or multi-stakeholder groupings that are taking additional action. And, it ends up kind of not mattering that the United States at the national level is not really playing a role. So yes, I think all of those things will continue and increase, in the absence of the U.S.
I mean, those are things that address the mitigation side, but in terms of financial flows towards adaptation, that I find it harder to see how that can happen in the absence of a really engaged set of developed countries. Do you agree, or has there been some private flow of capital to adaptation projects?
Right. The private flow has always been, easier to get in mitigation because it's been, more likely to yield return on investment than adaptation, which is why, it's been important for national governments to focus their public funding on adaptation. Well, just because the U.S. goes away doesn't mean other countries are not stepping up. If you just take the example of the Green Climate Fund, the U.S. put in $1 billion of the $3 billion pledge, and then there was a replenishment of the GCF, and a lot of the European countries basically doubled their pledges, their contributions in the absence of the U.S. So they didn't just say U.S. is out, therefore we're out. It was almost the opposite. Like, we're now going to kind of, in some senses, make up the difference. So, countries that care about the issue, they're not just going to follow the U.S. lead. But what's unfortunate is you could imagine how much good the United States could be doing if it were putting its muscle behind the issue, and you wouldn't have that.
I'm sure you saw this at COP25 in the Paris Pavilion. They had, in the France Pavilion, they had "Make Climate Great Again" hashtag over the stage. So definitely some countries have been stepping up when others have not. We like to ask our speakers at the end, is there something, we've been talking about a lot of, pretty difficult existential subjects. Is there something in all of this that has given you hope, especially in this crazy time of COVID on top of everything else?
Yeah. Well, there's a huge amount of enthusiasm at the kind of, if you want to call it the lower level. What I mean by that is just the sub-national level. That does give me hope because, it's a world that didn't really exist several years ago, which is now highly developed. In fact, I've wondered almost the opposite of what you asked, which is if Biden wins, does that keep up? Or is that, like, how much of it is a substitute for the federal government or a kind of resistance to the federal government? And how much is it like here to stay no matter what? And I actually think that would be kind of an interesting thing too.
I think that would be great. Yeah. We have one of our other fellows, Mauricio Rodas, when he talks about this, likes to always point out cities produce 70% of emissions. So if the mayors of the cities, the major cities of the world get together, we can make a big dent. So that's really quite interesting. Let me thank you, Sue, for these. We really covered a lot of ground, and I really want to thank you for this, your insights, and also really you've kicked off Penn's Climate Week, and I really thank you very, very much for that. Thank you. I also want to just say to all the students, staff, faculty who've helped to organize this amazing set of events this week. They've been working on it since last spring. We hope you'll all tune in for a lot of this week's programming. We also, before saying goodbye to Sue, want to just thank you all for joining us today and let you know that on Wednesday, we'll have an event that, as you'll see in the chat box, a link to it that continues this theme of the Paris Agreement and global climate negotiations. We'll host Patricia Espinoza, the Executive Secretary of the UN Climate Change Secretariat, and she'll be in conversation with Lisa Friedman from the New York Times. As always, you can see this recording of our conversation on the YouTube channel and follow many of our other upcoming events on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Sue will be our fellow this year, and we hope many times in the future. She's a great friend of Perry Worldhouse, and we have lots of projects we're cooking together. So thank you again, Sue, for this hour. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for your questions, which we couldn't all get to, and I hope you have a wonderful day and stay healthy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.